else to say a big thank you to the board, and particularly to Finola as well, and Sarah for their support, but also to the team for welcoming me so much, I think, in the last 6 months, and for enabling me to, I suppose, hit the ground running as well, and for giving me the space to develop this new strategy when I arrived also. So as many of you hopefully will have seen, our new strategy should be in your office, or indeed it's available online. And I'm just going to talk through a little bit of what it looked like, and I suppose how we interpret it here in the office in real terms, and to get your input into it as well. And we'll be joined by Rory de Burca, the General Director from Irish Aid, also to share his reflections on our new strategy. So firstly, I suppose when I started in this role, there was obviously a huge amount of work had already been done, where there was an extensive consultation with you on the future direction for Dóchas, but indeed of where you would like the sector to be in 2030. And to be honest, that was very much my starting point. There was a vision statement that was clearly expressed in the RIOS Reimagining project, which stated where we want to be in 10 years' time. And from that, I really tried to work back and say, okay, what does this mean now in practical terms for the next 5 years? How do we kind of need to shift our direction towards this aim, and at the same time ensure that we're putting the building blocks in place so we can achieve that by 2030? And I'm going to just share a little bit with you the overview of the strategy that hopefully should be slightly familiar to you at this stage. That is sharing there. Let me just go to full screen. Now, as you know, I definitely wasn't hired for my graphic design skills, but this very much is an overview of our strategy for the next 5 years. And it really is a new kind of strategic direction. When we were looking at kind of the different elements that came across within the reimagining project, within the evaluation, it was clear that, you know, they're having a strong and dynamic network is actually the overarching objective. It's not something that just kind of comes after, but is very much what we need to have in place in order to be able to fulfill all of our other objectives. And I think that was kind of one of the key elements that came out of this development of this strategy, that we need to actually, as a network, create the right platform, structure, spaces for you, for our members, to be able to connect, collaborate and coordinate. And I suppose it also needs to be very much reflective of the sector that we're in. We need to be, you know, the sector itself, you know, as many of you know, working in development, humanitarian organizations, where the context is changing a lot. You know, there's a need for all of us to be agile, responsive and opportunistic. And I think we need to ensure that we reflect that in our network structure as well, and that we can enable you as members to connect, to coordinate and to collaborate easily. That you can, if you have particular topics that are of interest to you, that you are easily able to know what other organizations within the network are interested in that, and you're able to coordinate and collaborate together. And it's really around building that foundation to enable that to happen is going to be a core focus for the next couple of years. And one thing I just want to mention about, I suppose, what is different, or how we envisage this being different in the next couple of years, is that we want to really break open the network. You know, there are very formalized structures in place, and some of them work quite well. But there is a reality that actually, in some ways, in terms of how we're structured, it can actually be quite exclusionary. And that perhaps if you are in one working group but not in another, you might not be aware of what is happening. You might have a slight interest, but not necessarily the time to engage in that topic. And, you know, how are we actually being able to share information and allow for that flow of information between members as well? So we want to ensure also that we create the right structure that allows people to meet and to convene based on the objective, you know, whether that is for one particular initiative, whether that's for a set period of time, or whether that is in the long term, like what we will be looking at in terms of locally led development, how we can move a piece of work forward collectively. And I think that, you know, what you may have noticed in the strategy itself is that we haven't been prescriptive in terms of what those topics might be that we will work on. We haven't stated, you know, that we will, you know, continue to work specifically on on areas around, or look at kind of areas around climate, or indeed humanitarian work or elsewhere. And it's really that we don't want to be prescriptive. We want to make sure that the platform is there so that if there are particular topics, that people can come together if they are relevant for our members. And I suppose having that strong structure and network in place enables us to be able to fulfill our other objectives as well. So when we look at the transform piece, it was very much, there's an objective here to help the Irish international development and humanitarian sector to transform by creating opportunities for increased impact. And we've explicitly said this with regards to the shifts in power in terms of resources to the global south, but also in terms of locally led development, in terms of standards of practice, including safeguarding and our codes on images and messaging. And it's looking at how, when there are, how we can actually introduce kind of more forward thinking, challenging and honest spaces for members to be able to come together to work on these issues where there is no clear one way or best way, but it's about figuring out together perhaps where you can support each other in exploring some of these key issues that are affecting everybody within the sector. And the next really is around our influence. And I think that, essentially one of the key strengths of Dóchas is our ability, I suppose, is our policy expertise and experience, and also our convening power. So the fact that within our 57 members, we have a huge amount of expertise, a huge amount of skills, and we actually, what we can bring to the table there is really around the convening power to be able to use create opportunities really for members to come together and to be able to leverage that influence at a political level or within the media or elsewhere. So really amongst other key stakeholders that we can leverage that influence that we can bring when we come together. And we want really to position Dóchas as the kind of the key voice on issues affecting the sector. And that's really around ensuring that, we can be, that we kind of lead in terms of any sort of discussions around policy areas or key issues that are affecting you as an organization, and that we can actually then kind of lead in terms of being the expertise that people rely on for that information as well. When we look then at lead, I think that this is very much linked also to influence, but also to the others, that, we were thinking, how can we also support and enable leaders in the sector to advocate on key issues? How can we actually provide that space and that support to members to do so? And within this lead objective, we've kind of broken it down into 3 different areas. One is around kind of existing leaders, how we can create that space for existing leaders to connect, to collaborate, to be able to lean on each other for support, but also to innovate and collaborate together. But also emerging leaders within the sector. How can we create that space to allow them to build their voice perhaps, or to advocate on key issues, or to bring them into the conversation so that we actually are kind of creating an environment that is not held by a number of or a select number of a few leaders within the sector, but that we are constantly looking at the emerging leaders and bringing them forward in our efforts to influence, to transform, and to create a very dynamic network. And then also within the lead, it was looking at very practically then at how Dóchas can support members in developing their leadership skills as well. How can we use our, I suppose, strength as a network to leverage other organizations or institutions to create those skills or training that might be available, and to see how we can support members in that regard. And I think really, when we go through those 4 objectives, an effective organization is critical to all of that. And, we've said, we do need diversified sources of funding. We need, a very mobilized, engaged team. We need to be all of these things. But I think one of the things that's absolutely fundamental to us to be able to fulfill this is actually, is really about living our values. So we have changed the values in this strategy. And that's very much on purpose. So it's, what is it that we value as a sector? What is it that we, how do we want to act? How do we want to work in the future? How do we want to engage with each other? And the five values that we have are very much focused on collaboration, on learning, on encouraging new ideas, on being on embodying courageous leadership, and on being agile as well. And that's something that, you know, it's not just for ourselves here in the office, but really that we want to see as a culture, you know, within the organizations, within the sector, that we are creating that space for members to be able to collaborate, to learn from each other, but also that we can come together collectively and be courageous in our leadership as a sector together. So on that, I might hand over to Rory to give some of his reflections on the strategy that has been shared. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jenan, and congratulations to you on taking up the job in your first AGM and on taking forward the strategy. A 5-year strategy at the moment. It's a really interesting frame, I think, given that we're at a period of real international volatility, and I think at a time of great change and challenge to development. And I think it's really interesting, and I think important, the 3 pillars that you've outlined for yourselves, because I think that will help Dóchas as a network and each of the members, you know, coming together to I think respond adaptively to the challenges that we're living through. You know, we've had COVID over the last few years and it hasn't gone away. Clearly, Ukraine conflict is at the top of the news agenda, but we all know that there are an increasing number of conflicts in many places where we work, or in some cases where we would like to be working, but circumstances have meant that some of you, or indeed in the case of Embassy in Ethiopia, some of us are finding it harder to work. And there are complications as well that we all have to navigate together. One is resources. There's huge demand on development and humanitarian resources, probably unprecedented in, you know, certainly in recent decades. But the pull is going to be in many other places as well. So I think that the strategy provides an interesting space for all of the Dóchas membership to think hard about what's the distinguishing feature and how does Dóchas, the Dóchas network, get its share of the resources, and how collectively do you try and make that pie grow. I think there's a challenge too in how you individually and collectively and working in partnership with us as well respond to the demand piece. What's the best way to do it, and are the ways in which we've all worked traditionally, are they still valid? And I think the strategy gives a space for those conversations and for a sort of a variable geometry moving forward. And I'm very conscious that geopolitics of where we work is evolving very, very quickly. So the old rules are maybe no longer going to apply. For example, can we presume that humanitarian action is going to be seen as independent? What does that mean for you, those of you who are engaged in humanitarian action on the ground? What does it mean for you if you have effectively an Irish flag over you as well? Because it looks like over the next decade, the world is going to be divided again into sort of a new set of great power challenges. We've seen the beginning of it perhaps with Ukraine, but I think we also see it on the ground in Africa, and we see new challenges to civil society space, and we see a great communication challenge on the ground in many places where we work, where we don't share truths anymore. There isn't an objectivity. We all work in complicated circumstances of subjectivity, and where the rules of the game, things like democracy, the values piece, are under threat. So how do we play defensively, collectively in that space? And then how do we, as the Department of Foreign Affairs, support you in maintaining, hopefully growing, the space in which you operate? And within that, what's the place for localization and working more, responding to that challenge, which is not just a humanitarian challenge. I think it's increasingly, and I know some of you are already really engaged in this, but how are you engaging over the next decade with local organizations, working through others? And then how do you bring that narrative back here and connect it back to your fundraising in a much more diverse Ireland, and do those messages have to change? And how do they evolve so that they're hitting the right notes in an Irish public that is increasingly multicultural, increasingly not as white as it used to be, sophisticated, potentially, maybe more cynical as well, and where there will be demands at home for responses. And I think the housing challenge at home, potentially, if it's not addressed fairly quickly, could see an opening up for a new selfishness. And I think there's a real interesting, and Jane Ann alluded to it, I think how you communicate with individually and collectively with particularly the political system is going to be a really interesting challenge, which I hope the new strategy really helps you on. We have an emerging big party, which hasn't been in government before, which may well be in government again. From the research that its electorate is maybe not as convinced, or at least a portion of its electorate is not as convinced on development issues as maybe some of the traditional parties. But I think it's also we have a responsibility in this as the department as well. But the narrative probably has to evolve so that what collectively we do in development is responding to what the political system see as today's challenges. And I think the strategy gives a good frame within which to explore and to test what those new political messages would be. And it's a bit about moving from beyond the convinced to the persuadable. And I think it's about articulating in part why what you do so well isn't just a good thing, although it is. It isn't just the right thing, although it is. But it's also a thing that's in our self-interest at home, as much as it is in the interests of those who we seek to support abroad. And I think the strategy gives a good basis to do that. And I suppose ultimately, I think Jane Ann's used the phrase "cracking open the network." I think it's about making sure that the conversations that we have as a community of practice or as a network are more porous, that it's not hermetically sealed, that we go out and we reach the places where perhaps other conversations aren't reaching. And I think there's a lot in this strategy which will I think give that make that possible. I think one of the things sort of when I was thinking about talking today, the word that kept coming to mind is change. And I think part of the problem is I think many of us, and I think COVID hasn't helped, there is been a lot of change over the last decade. There's been a lot of turbulence at home. I think many people have lived with a lot of stress, and looking ahead to maybe another 5-10 years of change kind of comes maybe with a bit of sense of burden. It's difficult, and many people in many organizations to a certain extent are tired, but I don't think we can avoid change. So I think there's a challenge back, and I hopefully within the strategy and as a network you know, the Dóchas family can sort of lean in on itself, and you can all work together to kind of keep that resilience through the inevitable changes over the period ahead, because I think that's really important. And the last thing on change is I started off by welcoming Jane Ann, and I understand that Finola is coming to the end of her time as chair as well. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, Finola. You've been a fantastic chair, and you know, you're not gone. I know that, so I'm not going. It's not a eulogy, but I just want to acknowledge what you've done, and to wish you the best with the extra time that you'll gain by stepping back from the chair once a new chair has been identified. And I'll stop there, and I'll pass back to you, Jane Ann. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rory. So our plan is to have a little bit of open up really the conversation now. There's a lot in there. I don't expect everybody perhaps has read the strategy from cover to cover, but perhaps if there are any questions or comments either on anything that myself and Rory said this morning, or indeed in the strategy itself, we'd happy to kind of to open up the discussion now, either through raising your hand or through any comments in the chat that you may have with regards to the strategy itself as well. So I'd like just to open the floor and see if anybody has any questions or comments at this stage about the future direction, perhaps, rather than, you know, it's not too much of a prescriptive plan. I think it's really around shifting the direction in terms of how we want to work in the future to be able to react and respond to a very changing external environment. Yes. Yeah. Any questions or comments? Yes, Alex, would you like to go ahead? Oh, you're just on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Thanks, Jane Ann, and thanks, Rory. That was very interesting. I think the new strategy, Jane Ann, congratulations. And what you had to say, Rory, I think also very important. I think, you know, at the age I am now, this is probably the most interesting time that we've ever had in my 60 years. And as our group, we're faced with probably the biggest international problems coming down the line over the next 2 or 3 years because of the food crisis that's about to explode, and it will affect all of our work outside of this country. I think that as a group, we should be looking to get together to persuade our government as a group that this is what's happening. You know, that it's so important that we pull back from the fighting that's going on as quickly as possible. That mightn't be a solution that is acceptable to everybody, but you know, in the longer term, it's probably by far and away the best. And I would ask that the rest of the members think about this as part of our, you know, collaboration together over the next month or so, and of a collaboration and a task that we must take very urgently. I wonder what you have to say to that, Rory, and also you, Jana. Thank you.
Rory, would you like to go ahead, or I can step in? I think just one thing you mentioned there, Alex, I think it's very relevant, and I think it is a very pertinent time. I think when you know, the Ukraine crisis came to the fore, I think in Dóchas, as everybody was a little bit surprised and trying to see actually, okay, where do we sit as a sector here in this, you know, being very aware, even from my humanitarian background, that I'm sure every individual organization is very much trying to understand how they can actually react and respond on the ground. But there is that bit about balancing that level of, there is an interest, and there is definitely in the last few months, myself and Louise have been kind of proactively engaging on the political side, and there is a real willingness and a want for information. and that is coming to us. Everybody is time poor, you know, like ourselves, but there is that real want for information, and it's really now, it's nearly a challenge back to us to see how can we actually, what is it that we want to say, you know, what is it that we want to actually push for, and how, you know, how can we be a bit more strategic in our communications, in our advocacy, in our lobbying work, you know, that we don't, it's not just about the kind of the ODA campaign, you know, and that's very much and it's taking the ODA campaign out of kind of a 3 or 4 month cycle or preparatory work, but it's about really speaking out on these issues from our sector perspective, and ensuring that that voice from the sector is very much central in these discussions. And it's not just about obviously just the war itself in Ukraine, but obviously the knock-on effect and impact that I know that, you know, members have spoken to us about, you know, in terms of what's happening now with regards to the food crisis or pending food crisis in Africa. So it's really then kind of putting it back to say, what is it that we can do together to sound that alarm and say this really needs attention, and we are the experts in this, and present ourselves as the experts, and do that at a political level with all of the other stakeholders, the media level as well. And that's something that we will be following with members with in the next couple of weeks. And I'm hoping that, you know, there is that level of a willingness, I would say, amongst the group here today to support us in that endeavour, because you're the experts. You know, we can mobilise the meetings and the convenings and everything, but you essentially are the experts, and we really want to bring that expertise, that knowledge to the fore and put them in front of the right people to make sure that we can have that impact. So with that, I'll hand over to Rory. If there's anything, Rory, you want to add to that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple of challenges. You know, I suppose the first one is each of you are also your own competition to a certain extent in terms of fundraising. So I think there has to be a real, you know, I think it's about when you come together in the Dóchas sense and as experts, where do you add value? And I think there's something there about a sort of a strategic approach that I think is worth drilling into. That's maybe a little bit more longitudinal. It's not about today's crisis, but it's about where we need to be in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, and why investing in development and in humanitarian action today gets us to means we won't have to invest as much in 5 years or 10 years' time. And I think there's a climate change in a sense helps with that, because that's I think a strategic opportunity for the sector in terms of cutting through. One of the things with COVID is that, you know, it's revealed what we know in the sector, but it's revealed more broadly that interconnection between, I suppose, safety and security abroad and investing in other people's systems, and our safety and security at home, and the integrity and strength of our systems. From a national financial perspective, you know, a challenge is that, you know, one of the consequences of COVID and the Ukraine war is the macroeconomic situation, and potentially, you know, what's going on with the UK at the moment means that the macroeconomic environment is less benign than it was forecast to be, which means that, you know, when it comes down to allocations to ODA, the resource arguments are going to be tougher, you know, and I think it's about working very assiduously at a granular level, including in TD's clinics, but to build a constituency up. And I think a place where individually and collectively Dóchas members have a real comparative advantage and can do things, say, we can't do, is you can invite politicians to come and visit your programs. That's really powerful when you do that. Really, really powerful. And we've lost 2 years of that because of COVID. So I think that's worth thinking about individually and collectively. And maybe, and appreciate if an organization brings somebody, they want to show their stuff, but maybe think of some top line and agree some top line strategic messages for those visits. I think could be really, really useful, that are shared, that are strategic, and feed into the desired outcomes. And the final thing I'll say is the media landscape isn't particularly helpful. That editors don't find development stuff that interesting, don't think that their readers or their viewers are that interested. And that, in one sense, I think underestimates the audience. But I think there's a challenge back to each one of us, and we're trying to do some work ourselves. And I think this goes back to discussions a couple of Dóchas AGMs ago. I think the one in Croke Park particularly. But how we package what we do, is it maybe a little stale? Do we have to repackage at a time when journalists are really, really busy? Do we have to do more of the sort of the work for them and give them the narrative arc in new and interesting ways? Do we have to challenge them to think about the world slightly differently and our place in it? And I think one of the things I liked about the strategy is that I think it opens up a space for that kind of reflection. And I think that's probably something that we need to work with you on and learn from you on. And that's one of the reasons why, we work with Dóchas on the research. And I think that research should help inform some of the thinking that collectively we do around that sort of communications outreach. How much of it do we use traditional media for? How much do we become our own publisher? And how do we cut through the noise that's out there? I'll stop with that. Hopefully that made sense in terms of a response.
Thank you, Rory. I'd just like to open up again if there's anyone else that has any questions or comments on anything that's been said, or indeed on any elements of the strategy. So, I think just one thing that you touched on, Rory, that I would like to mention, and I think it kind of feeds into the how we influence piece, is around some of that, integrating some of that common messaging. And I think, I'm well aware that, individual organizations have their own mandate and way of doing things and their own objective and different viewpoints. But there is commonality there. And I think that's where, I do want to move away from, okay, we have, does everybody agree with a very short statement that we do, and or something that's going to go into the paper, and try to, come with very, I want to move away from trying to create very hardline positions as Dóchas. I think that actually it's about kind of agreeing some kind of core messaging that's universal to our members, and that we are all in agreement with, that we all want to see happen in order to progress both at an Irish political level and elsewhere. And that we integrate and weave that in, like as you said, either whether that's through our political messaging individually and collectively, but also in terms of visits and elsewhere. So it's just that piece around being a little bit more strategic on how we can incorporate some of those common messages amongst the membership here towards that common, that kind of mutual objective really of increasing aid. Cillian, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Jana. Yeah, just to pick up on that comment, Rory, some great points throughout, and we are living in strange times. But I wonder if we do as a sector need, and we were recently involved with the DevEd, or now Global Citizenship Education, and we have as a community and as the department, you have strategies for primary, and historically, a lot of our dev ed, I think, has been focused in primary schools and secondary schools, and we do have third level strategic partners in place and things like that. But I wonder if beyond that, there's a need for an advocacy fund from Irish Aid or the department that is sort of PR perhaps, but is kind of is trying to speak to the general population, to the journalists, to voters, citizens, to say, look, these are the issues of our time, and this is the reason we do what we do. This is the reason why we're striving for that 0.07%, and that advocacy fund, because a lot of the times I think globally we see great filmmakers, great communicators can make these issues mainstream. You know, a really good documentary about, say, true cost can make the issues around sweatshops a mainstream conversation. It can bring it into business circles and beyond. And I wonder if that's sort of and I know we have the Simon Cumbers Media Fund, but I wonder if it's sort of in that space, not just films, but other, other types of kind of bold investment in advocacy. It's not all going to work. It could be in the arts, it could be in hosting exhibitions, but maybe some sort of pot that sends, is kind of entrepreneurial and a bit bold in that way might be of interest, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Killian. I see Carol has a hand up as well. Maybe we'll go to Carol, and then if you want to come back, and then Rory, if that's okay. Carol?
Great, thanks, Jane Ann, and thanks, Rory, for the input. It was really interesting, and I was really struck by what you were saying about the political context, that things maybe we take for granted might shift quite significantly within the Irish political context in terms of support for overseas aid. And I think there's something that we as a sector need to kind of think through, because on one hand, the message has been, if we, like you said, if we give now, we'll have to do less in 5 or 10 years. But actually, it could be the opposite, the way things are going with conflict, with humanitarian need, with the food and fuel crisis. So there's a couple of kind of conflicting things happening in reality, that actually, there are these huge systemic issues. Climate change, I mean, we're only beginning, obviously, the impact of that is just going to keep increasing and increasing. So there is a kind of, I think, a need for us as a sector to think through, what is the message here? Because I don't know if it is really that in 5 or 10 years, actually, we hope it will be less, unless we can address really actively some of these big systemic issues. And I think that's something that we need to think through, and that also work with, members of the public, political parties who may not see as much value in overseas aid. And it's harder to make the business case in this world of multiple crises that are happening. And I think the other thing for us as a sector, I mean, we shouldn't be in existence the way we are in perpetuity. We should be looking at if we're doing the same thing we're doing in 10 years' time, something's not working. And, with the whole view of localization and shifting power, but then we have this conflicting reality of those crises that are going to create more and more situations of inequality, of humanitarian need. So I think there is something that we have to think through about that messaging as a sector with political actors, because the context is so challenging. Thank you.
Rory, would you like to just want one more hand up here from Jim? Would you like to come in, or would you?
Let's take Jim's
Sure.
first, and then I'll come back on the
Sure,
three.
great. Yeah, Jim, would you like to get?
Sure, yeah, thanks. And well done, Jane Ann, and everybody on the strategy. I really like it. I think we do need to think about, on the influencing it political bit, I think we need to maybe dive a little bit deeper as to where Dóchas's key role is, and then where individual members' key roles are. But that's a kind of a more specific thing for another time. But I suppose just a reflection, and I think it was really helpful to hear, Rory, your thoughts on this. I do think we're going to be tremendously challenged to cut through on messaging over the next period. We are at a lot of time anyway, but I think it's going to be even more so. But for me, I think, and you referenced it, Rory, and I think we need to seriously look at how things like the pandemic and climate and some of the other issues that we are fighting in the countries in which we work are actually universal themes. Gross inequality, violence against women and girls, climate, pandemic, inequality. There are so many things that, yes, they impact differently and in more severe ways oftentimes in the countries in which we work. But there are things that affect everybody here, or lots of people here too. And how we can bridge that narrative to bring people along with us, including in new political spaces and so on. Say, actually, the struggle that we're fighting against is everybody's struggle. It's not them over there, as our sector has probably been guilty of kind of framing over decades, really. And I think there's a link then to the conference later on, and which I think is really welcome. And, how do we, really transform ourselves to make sure that we are locally led, that we are, that it is the voices of the South that are preeminent in our work, I mean, even if you look around this room, we're not a very diverse group here. Let's be honest. You know, we have quite a distance to go, and we should challenge ourselves on that, because I do think it'll be, you know, first of all, there's a real question of legitimacy and who we speak for and how we do it. But there's also a question about how do we communicate with the public? How do we bring the public with us? How do we transform that narrative that sometimes feels quite old and feels like it's not going to get us there, you know? And there's still very much the charity space, the charity thinking. And I know that's not the way people around this room think, but I think that is the way the message lands oftentimes. So, you know, we need to be quite strong in looking to transform that narrative. And I think there's great appetite to do it. But I'd be as ambitious as we possibly can, because it's essential for survival and it's essential for our mission.
Thanks, Jim, for that. Would you like to respond to any of those comments, Rory?
Yeah, I mean, I think all three interventions, you know, in many ways echoed each other in different ways, and I think they point to a challenge, and I think we've kind of all touched on these challenges over the last while in different places and formats. So I think the question is then now, and I think hopefully your strategy, Jane-Ann, you know, provides a space. How do we move from admiring the problem to dealing with the problem? And I think that does require a bit of deep thinking, and it is. I think there's a degree to which we all have to be uncomfortable, because if we're comfortable, nothing is probably changing, and we're probably kind of going back to where we are. So so within that, I think it's also what can each one of us do? And I maybe just wanted to pick up Killian's point about an advocacy fund. I have to say, I'm uncomfortable as a civil servant that we would fund people to agitate specifically for more money out of the funding, you know, in a sort of a circular way. I think that would leave us open to criticism. I'm not certain, you know, it would pass the sniff test of the McKenna judgment around referendums, even if it was done differently. I think, but I think one of the reasons we brought out the global education, global citizenship strategy is to go as close to that as we can. We've really tried in this, and we will be increasing the budget over time, doubling it, to try and get beyond schools and to try and explode the engagement from just the education system to kind of the whole of life. And we've really tried to engage with councils, with people like Macron Pharma and other organizations like that are much broader, to have and to link it back, something we did with A Better World, to link the narrative back to concepts of development that people can relate to in their real life. You know, and we depend on all of you as well to kind of have similar conversations with your stakeholders, your broader stakeholders as well in that. And then in the repackaging of Africa Day over the last while, which I know was slightly controversial when we didn't kind of continue with the big day out in Farmley, which frankly it got too big for us to manage, and we were getting into all sorts of potential issues around management of Phoenix Park and all of that. But taking that problem, we decided, no, actually we needed to engage people where they lived on questions around our kind of relationship as Irish people with Africa. And one of the ironies of the big thing in Farmley was it let some of the Dublin councils off the hook in terms of that part of the conversation. And it's been interesting. And this year, you know, we've turned Africa Day now into a week. We have most of the county councils engaged, and it's about a celebration of African culture. And within that, then we can start a more mature conversation about our relationship with the continent, which moves, I think, a bit of the discourse along, but not enough on its own. But it's a place, and it's moving away from what Jim described as the charity model into a more holistic discussion. But there are real opportunities, I think, you know, by going into the research, understanding what the drivers are, and then really trying to break things down into a series of sophisticated messages tailored to individual elements. And the last thing on the advocacy point is, we did a brilliant video last year for Africa Day. I don't know if people saw it. It was called Two Swallows, which was an Irish storyteller and a West African storyteller telling stories and using the metaphor of swallows, which of course go between Ireland and Africa. And it was nothing to do with the traditional images of Africa, or nothing to do with a high level discourse around aid, but it was all to do with interconnection, interdependency. You know, I learned on Monday that the music which we commissioned for that has been nominated for an award, which we nominated for an award because we thought the video was really good, has won an award in a prestigious advertising piece. So I just say that to say we'll try and do our bit within the resources we have, but it won't be headline advocacy. It'll be subtle. And on the hardcore stuff around resourcing and 0.7, which is a bit unsubtle, if I can say, you know, because you don't go from 0.31, 0.32, where we've been for 6 years, to 0.7 in one jump. So it's hold out the target, but what's the next step? What's the achievable target by the end of this government's mandate? And I think that's something that we can advise on quietly in the background, but we do rely on you in the sector to build the alliances around, because it's the public who create political demand. It's not civil servants. So I think there's a challenge to us all in trying to move that along a little bit. So we're happy to have quiet conversations, but I think it's an area where Dóchas can and do lead. So with that, Jane, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Rory. So if there are no other questions or comments for now, I just want to mention, I suppose, just to give you an indication of some of the practical next steps. So obviously the strategy is all very, you know, ambitious, and but we're charged here in the team with trying to be like, right, what does this actually mean practically now? And we've already very much started work on it, but there's very much now where we do need you as the members to come on board in terms of helping us to implement this in practice. And as I mentioned, you know, there is that we will be, and we already are starting conversations around the ODA budget at a political level. And I think one of the most interesting things, we had a meeting last week with Minister Coveney, and it was around the priorities for the last 6 months in the UN Security Council was the primary objective of the meeting. But one of the first things he said after when we spoke on a number of issues, that there were a number of members present, you know, he said it's such a relief to have a meeting where we're talking about the issues, where we're talking about policy issues, rather than just funding. And I think that that is also a message back to the sector, that we are the experts in key issues, we are the experts in key policy areas, and we need to lead from that front and to then really highlight, you know, where we are, what needs to happen from our perspective, and then, you know, bring in the messaging, particularly around ODA, to support that. And that's something that we'll be working on in the next couple of months, and that we'll be reaching out to you and your teams for support and engagement on, and for participation in, to be able to convey those messages in the right way to the right people as we go along this journey. And then another area that we're progressing on, obviously, is our locally led development, and I'm hoping I will see many of you in the conference this afternoon. And it's really the objective this afternoon is really around moving it from the, you know, we have collectively agreed as a sector, this is something we want to work on, this is an issue affecting all of us. And it's really now looking at, okay, well, what does that mean in practical terms? What are some of the topics within locally led development that we think is of value for us as a Dóchas membership to come together on? And it's really trying to explore that as to what are some of those areas where we really want to take forward and work on collectively, whether that's for a policy objective, an advocacy objective, or a practice perspective. You know, what is it that we want to bring forward? And that's going to be really I wouldn't say the launch, because we've been talking about locally led development for a while, but it's very much around reinvigorating that conversation now and being very practical about what we're going to do about it and how we're going to take it forward. And then lastly, just also, it's really about, it comes back to the network piece. And I mentioned this at the beginning, it is around creating the right structures and systems and platforms really for you to be able to engage with each other. And I think I'm very aware, even coming in, you know, in the last few months, I'm trying to see, okay, how do we communicate with people in different ways? How is this that one organization might know what the other working group is doing or not? And how do our members really even know what each other is working on in terms of priorities, and that to be able to pick up the phone or otherwise and to say, look, I know we're working on the same particular topic and we are interested in trying to move this forward from an advocacy perspective or otherwise, are we interested in doing that together? And that's the point where we want to reach at Dóchas. And I think it's so we are, in order to do that, we do need to build our infrastructure to reflect that. And one of the first steps will be around exploring as the network delegate role, so that we kind of have key focal points within all the organizations that are very much aware and engaged in terms of where we want some of the key issues that we're bringing forward together as a network going in the future. Second then is around network mapping. We're going to be coming out to all of you with quite an extensive survey, but it's really around really understanding not only, you know, where you work, what you do, but also what you're actually interested in meeting with other members about. And it's really about gathering that level of data so that we can present it back to you to say, these are, whether it's something like climate finance, whether it is on Ireland's, the principle of neutrality in Ireland, whether it's on any of these issues, that we can actually say, these are about 5 organizations that are interested in this. This is the other organizations that are interested in this, and actually giving you the tools and the knowledge to be able to connect and collaborate with each other on topics of interest, and to try to, I suppose, encourage that level of collaboration and coordination on issues affecting the sector. So we will be reaching out to you to help us with that, to help us build the infrastructure that we need to create a very dynamic and engaged network where we can create more impact by working together. So with that, I'll hand back to Finola, I think, for some of the election results. Thanks.